Welcome to our Soul and the City podcast. This is a community podcast which endeavors to make artistic strolls with fun, one city at a time, but more importantly, absorb, dissect, and reflect socially aware dialogues together with local wordsmiths, event organizers, artists, and art enthusiasts. My name is Soar, author and social innovator, and I will be co-hosting each episode with a team of international hosts and guests in the attempt to ignite and incite universal and individual insights. Welcome everybody to a fun, witty, and socially engaged journey around the world. This is our 5th summer edition podcast called It's a Spice Thang, the Caribbean Heat. And we have amazing guests, this time mainly migrants and expats or natives living in or outside the Caribbean, along with my great co-host support, Daniel. Daniel is a literature teacher at an international school, a cultural connoisseur, a passionate basketballer, and a writer currently living in Prague. He's the co-host of our Soul and the City WEPodcast, in which we try to debunk city stereotypes, raise awareness on social issues, dissect and highlight important aspects related to the artistic and international community in each city.
And Soar is a polyglot, a social innovator, and an ambassador for multilingual dialogue, founder of Soul and the City, an international undertaking of artistic, educational, and entertaining projects.
Right. And today with us, we have Lisa and Norma. This is an exceptional podcast, meaning that we have 2 parts. We also had Jason the other day, and we will have, because it's such an interesting travel and story about the Caribbean, we decided to have 2 main parts because we try to be comprised to 1 hour and a half, but I will give the listeners the time to have a break, a pause. So we will have definitely a break between the two podcasts so that it's not too much, not too overwhelming on the time structure. Daniel, will you introduce us please to the podcast?
Gladly. As Soul and the City has explored such urban gems as Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Prague, we now venture into the Caribbean with more of an open slate, the soul of the archipelago, perhaps. Of course, we hear the magic of Kingston Town from Bob Marley. We see a unique side of Havana in the film Buena Vista Social Club. We gravitate to the streets of Port of Spain when we think of celebrations like Carnival or Jose. Just as likely, though, our imagination ventures to the beaches, the villages, the fetters of sugarcane fields that cut out from the jungle. Poets like Grace Nichols have always carried deep these islands, this piece of Atlantic coastland inside me, she says, sky deep, sea deep, as star is to stone, as tide is to shore. Nobel Prize laureate Derek Walcott depicts an origin story of the Caribbean. Then all the nations of birds lifted together the huge net of the shadows of this earth in multitudinous dialects, twittering tongues, stitching and crossing it. John Agard laments a history determined by colonists. Them tell me about Columbus in 1492, but what happens to the Caribs and the Arawaks too? He ends this poem with affirmation, though. But now, I checking out me own history, I carving out me identity. When I was carving out my own identity as a 16-year-old in Chicago, the newly independent nation of Grenada was invaded by the US and a coalition of neighboring Caribbean islands. The fear was that Grenada might go down a political path parallel to Cuba or Nicaragua or other communist governments in the region. Grenada had freed itself from British rule and might seek the patronage of another giant empire, the Soviet Union. Media coverage of the short war was banned, so I tried to imagine the indigenous people of Grenada, what they'd want of their way forward. I tried to think beyond the impression that the island was a ping pong ball swatted this way and that. Fast forward to today, we have the chance to connect with a truer array of local perspectives from many cultures of the Caribbean. We have the chance to deepen and even correct the historical record. By and large, the archipelago has common agreements for regional protection, a we're in this together sense of empathy. But what about its soul?
Exactly. So today we'll be in search of the soul and the spices of the Caribbean. And as our listeners already know from our past podcasts, we always focus on 3 pillars: the witty, the artistic life, and the countless opportunities, the fun, the best things that we would miss about the Caribbean, and the socially engaged dialogue, specifically with topics on discrimination, minority groups, ethnic groups, Blacks, LGBT groups, liberties, cultural assimilation, diversity, inclusion restraints, biases, and sexuality from the perspective of our guests. And while discussing with my co-hosts, due to the incredible richness and diversity, we couldn't find a city to represent the entire island. So we decided exceptionally to pursue the main aspects of some of them, mainly Grenada, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Dominican Republic. We have just had another island, the cold and sun-deprived Iceland, represented by Reykjavik. We are still wondering about the cultural weight of an island and in general, and its potential as a diversity platform or a pleasure playground for tourists, especially that the Caribbean islands entail every possible dream of a cultural and touristic adventure. That being said, social political issues like cultural appropriation, Eurocentrism, contradictions, linguistic barriers, sexism, xenophobia, racism, among others may rise as we try to debunk stereotypes together with our guests. And here I have two terms that I would like to make our listeners aware of that may come up in our discussions. One is a griot. Griot is a member of a class of traveling poets, musicians, and storytellers who maintain a tradition of oral history in parts of West Africa. The second term is Eurocentrism, which is a worldview that is centered on Western civilization, or a biased view that favors it over non-Western civilizations. So these two terms may come across during our discussions, and it's nice for our listeners to understand what we are trying to approach. So I'm going, before we ask our guests, we are going to have just a little bit of introduction on the demographics of the islands. According to the World's Population Review, the main ethnicities are groups of indigenous people: Africans, Indians, Europeans, Chinese, and Portuguese. Indigenous people, the earliest inhabitants were the Carib, Arawak, and Siboney groups of indigenous people who migrated from South Africa. Overall population, there are 28 countries, out of which 25 are independent. 43 million inhabitants, 67% being of Afro descendants. Population on individual islands are very different. Trinidad has white and Hispanic, 46% and 46% respectively, while in Barbados only 2.7% of population is white. The strongest source of European ethnicity in the Caribbean, however, is Spanish. Roughly 60% of the Caribbean speak Spanish. In nations such as Cuba and Puerto Rico, Spanish heritage almost entirely dominates the ethnic identity. And I think we're going to talk about this with Lisa, right? We wanted to talk about this linguistic diversity. We're going to get there in a second. Caribbean becomes the most racially diverse region on the planet after having its ancestry and genetics permanently altered through European colonialism and migration. Now, Leah, when I asked you about what subject lies to your heart and what you want to talk about as we dwell into this beautiful subject, you mentioned Eurocentrism and the cultural contradictions and the linguistic barriers that culturally divide you and isolate you as a people within the Caribbean community. Cuba and Puerto Rico versus Jamaica versus Haiti. Can you please delve into that for our listeners?
Yes, of course, I'd be happy to. First of all, I'd like to give you a little introduction about myself. My name is Lisa Lee de Los Angeles Guzman Rodriguez, affectionately called Lisa. And I'm a 2D and 3D illustrator, born and raised in the Dominican Republic, and I've lived there for the past 27 years. I just only recently came to Europe, and it's really been a journey of discovery, of comparison, like the life that I had there and how it affects the life that I come to have here. I think that's why I chose the topic of Eurocentrism, because all too often we perceive things, even in the Caribbean, we perceive things to be more European than they should be. And I'll explain real quickly. When you give a child a pen and paper and you ask them to draw a house, in the Dominican Republic, as well as in the US and Europe, they would draw a square with a triangle roof and maybe a little chimney on the top, right? With one door and maybe one door with a doorknob and then windows to each side, right? And this might seem normal to you, but in the Dominican Republic, where I live, where it's so unbearably hot all the time, bordering, 28 degrees every day, we have never seen a chimney in real life. The first time I saw a chimney in real life, I was well into my adulthood. So why do we teach children that this is the way that they should draw a house. Why do they teach them about an apple, which is, the first fruit you learn about as a child, rather than learning about, say, a mango? There aren't any apple trees in the Dominican Republic. So I think that this has sort of been driven to us from the start. And as an artist, I can see how a lot of the themes and subjects that we choose to explore are sort of seen through the lens of a person that's, a bit European without really being European. So we can't authentically, and, I don't want the European audience to interpret that I'm saying that European is bad, right? I think that it's inauthentic coming from somebody in the Dominican Republic, because we do not know about Europe the same way you guys know about Europe. But still, we are being, educated and forced into communicating in that way. And it gives such an unauthentic view of what Europe really is. And it doesn't allow people to sort of grow artistically as a whole. And it's something that has always concerned me.
Amazing. You also wanted to talk about this linguistic differences from one island to another, which instead of bringing you together, kind of isolates you from one another.
Yes, I think it's something that it's really a marked difference in the linguistics in the Spanish Caribbean. And even though we have not just in the Spanish Caribbean, let me rephrase, despite the fact that we are such a small, region, there really isn't any cultural exchange between people from different parts of the Caribbean. If, for example, we share an island with Haiti, right? And Haiti, and both us and Haiti are two of the countries with the highest amount of population. And yet us Dominicans know very little to nothing about Haitian culture, which is extremely sad, because they speak French and we speak Spanish. Same with Jamaica. The most I know about Jamaican culture, I've learned from watching TV and, hearing Bob Marley and anything like that. But there isn't much of an exchange with people in the Caribbean of different languages. And even to the point where even in the Spanish Caribbean, the manner in which one speaks is very much something that isolates you from other communities. Because for the longest time in the Dominican Republic, we've been seen as that we speak it in a joke Spanish. They really discount our way of pronouncing things and a way of communicating, because they feel that it's not near enough to the Spanish that one would speak in Spain. So when we speak, instantly the accent, the melody, the sounds make people not listen to us at all. So we've learned from early on to change our language in order to communicate with other people. So this is something that I think is very apparent in art, when in music, especially when you see kids that don't speak that way change the way that they need to speak in order to sing a song, or in order to recite poetry, or even just to step in front of their peers and talk, because they feel like they won't be taken seriously. And it's something that makes me very sad, because it's something that's uniquely beautiful about our culture, the way that we invent language, the way that we produce these melodic sounds. Just, it's not appreciated so far. And it's something that has been changing, sadly, in the terms of cultural appropriation, because artists such as, Rosalia or Nati Peluso, artists who are not from the Dominican Republic or not from the Caribbean, they adopt the manner in which Caribbean people talk and appropriate these mannerisms, these styles, the slang, in order to give themselves a little bit more of like street cred. And it's something that a lot of people are starting to sort of be angered by, because why isn't it possible for us to appreciate it when it's ourselves, but when it's somebody else, we're so ready to welcome them into the fold. Whenever they see, if a Spanish person comes, if an American person comes to Dominican Republic and says the popular phrase, "Que lo que," which would mean like, "What's up?" "Que es lo que hay" is the long version of it. Then immediately we're filled with delight. We're like, "Yeah, que lo que, mi hermano." And we see that connection with them that we don't otherwise see in Dominican people who say it as well. You know, it's seen as a lower class thing. So it's very much divided, the linguistics and the culture divided by class in ways that I feel are more marked than in other countries.
That's a good segue to Norma, if we can get your point of view on this, the cultural foundations and evolutions, and whether that's language-based or otherwise. Norma, would you introduce yourself first and then maybe pick up on that point?
Yes, so I'm Norma. I have a degree in art history from the Universidad de Salamanca in Spain, and I have a degree in museum studies from New York University in the US. So I've had the experience of having lived in the Caribbean for most of my life, and then having these very formative years in Europe and in the US, and having experienced some of what Lisa was just talking about. I have specialized in the history of poster design in the Dominican Republic and in the Dominican pavilions in 19th and 20th century World's Fairs. And you can see from very early on, you can see the struggle in how we try to define ourselves and how we try to present ourselves to in an international context, right? You can see it especially in World's Fairs, because this is a moment when it's specifically about representation. It's about specifically presenting yourself to other countries as you would like to be seen. And you can see the contrast, for example, in travel narratives from the 19th and early 20th centuries. People who are from the US, people who were from Europe, coming here and writing about us in a way that is sometimes exoticizing the culture. It sometimes feels a little othering. And then you see sources, Dominican sources from the same time period, and the way in which we try to present ourselves and sort of appeal to that Eurocentrism by saying, oh, we're not that exotic, we're not that different. Look at how we dress. The men will wear suits just like any European. We will eat. Maybe some of our food is different, but we still eat, at the table with the same china that everybody else does. And you can see this in art. You can see this in posters. And you definitely can see it in the pavilions, in different World's Fairs. Of course, it's always important, the context. It really depends on what message you're trying to get across, right? Do you want to be seen as something, as a very modern country because you want to attract foreign investors? Do you want to be seen, for example, there was an Ibero-American World's Fair in 1929 in Seville, and the people who designed the Dominican Pavilion specifically appealed to that sort of shared history that we have with Spain. And our pavilion was in the shape of a very emblematic building here, but a colonial era building. When in 1929 at the time, it had been, almost 500 years, and our architecture had evolved greatly since then. But really, there's always been sort of that push and pull of we knowing how people see us, and we trying to appeal to that gaze, to that othering gaze, and saying, no, we're really not as different as you're trying to portray us.
Yeah, this is really important, I think, for our exploration of perception and intention. And I wanted to pick up on this term, cultural appropriation. When I first heard that, and I think I first heard it well before I could Google search, a definition, I thought it meant like what's appropriate for a culture. And I didn't understand even that part of it. fast forward to when Justin Bieber, tries out dreadlocks for a concert tour, and is that appropriate? Is it cultural appropriation? I wanted to kind of pick up on what your definition might be on that, and how we can kind of go forward to understand and maybe even remedy some things about cultural appropriation.
Absolutely. I would like to sort of change a little bit the way that we think about cultural appropriation, because a lot of people hear, oh, I'm not allowed to do something or other, and immediately they get a very visceral reaction. And I don't want people to think of it in those terms. I want people to think that it's not what you're not allowed to do, it's what's rude for you to do, like what's disrespectful for you to do. And the biggest, when people speak about cultural appropriation, they're very quick to say like things like, oh, like the dreadlocks, like maybe wearing like a headpiece from another country, and that's all valid. But what people really need to understand, that the difficult part about cultural appropriation is watching other people profit monetarily from a culture that they do not understand. So a lot of what we see is, for example, people from Europe saying, oh, I want to start selling, this mango juice that's popular in the Dominican Republic, right? But they're not using the mangoes that we're used to seeing. They'll say like, oh, let's add spice to it, not knowing that Dominicans don't really eat a lot of spice. And then when they finally present the final product that they want to sell, or that they want to, gain some monetary value off of that, then it's so far removed from the culture that it's not part of the culture at all. So it ends up being, like, why use this at all? Why don't you just, find your own way of, of doing that? So I think that it needs to be framed in strictly in a way that recognizes that we are in it's not just losing respect, it's that we're losing money as well. We're not giving the opportunities to profit off of what's something that belongs to us. In many cases, even this is something that's there's a Dominican creator, right? She's of European descent, and she makes very beautiful purses that are done in a traditional way. They're called macutos, right? And it's a woven, sort of like a woven basket type purse, right? And she charges a very high amount for these purses. She charges about 100 to 200 euro per purse. And when actual women that have, so much history of learning how to do this in the countryside, they can't sell those purses for more than 5 euro, 10 euro at the most. So it creates like a bridge, a gap. Like, why are these women who have the ancestral knowledge, who have decades of experience that do these purses, cannot earn the same profit as a blonde-eyed blue European girl who decided to do the same thing? So it's hard for us to watch that, and it's hard for our culture to have to be erased, because when there aren't people, making money off of something, then demand falls, so does the supply, and we're losing each in one of those practices, because when Europeans or European descent people are appropriated, they do it to cater to their audience and are able to profit off that. So I would just, ask for people to not think about, or rather to think more about who they really are supporting when they choose to participate in the culture. Because I'm sure that if you were to buy a purse from a Dominican lady, it would not be cultural appropriation, because you would be supporting a local person and you would be using something that's not part of a closed practice, so to say.
This is what Jason had talked about as well, kind of the give and take, the good and bad of tourism, and how much that can bring people to experiences, but often also kind of let the tourist industry sort of determine what the experience will be, as distinct from a more indigenous walk. So I really appreciate this connection.
No, I was just going to add that the interesting thing is that tourism it's another gaze, right? And sometimes you find yourselves operating under that gaze and sort of adjusting yourself for that gaze. And definitely, I feel that sometimes in the Caribbean, even our countries, we adapt in a way that lets us, because our economy is so heavily reliant on tourism, we find ourselves doing things that we wouldn't otherwise.
Absolutely. And this is tied into something that happened in recent events. One cultural practice of Dominican people called gaga was completely outlawed by the Dominican government because they felt that it did not fit in within that tourist idea of what Dominican Republic music should be. And we can see this, that even like as we talk about cultural appropriation, even as we talk about tourism, the worst sort of agent against Dominican culture ends up being, the government itself and the culture that values white supremacy over all other things.
It's nice that you touched on the music, because I would have had a question regarding the music, and also a little bit connected to the stereotypes that unfortunately the Caribbean are always somehow seen with. There's a lot of stereotypes that we see when we think of the Caribbean, and not just us Europeans. I think it's in general. The Caribbeans are represented by Jamaica, Bob Marley, and exotic sceneries, and that's about it. The rum. I was told yesterday, we had a longer conversation with Jason, and he was explaining a little bit how Bob Marley really made a positive cultural representation of his island throughout the entire world, as compared to other famous personalities. I'm not gonna, or maybe I should mention, I don't know, who come from the Caribbean but do not represent the island as Bob Marley used to, through his music and through everything that he did. Nowadays, the people who are in fashion or in the film industry or in music industry, they kind of tend to represent themselves. They would do some charitable work or this and there. They would have that inclination to come back to their island and do something, but still they represent themselves. They do not represent the island. They do not transmit anymore the values of the island. And he was making this interesting analogy between Bob Marley and Rihanna, which is a little bit, on a topic to maybe we don't have time to talk about it that much, but he just wanted to emphasize how important it is to transmit any cultural value that you have through everything that you do, especially if you reach to a level where people will follow you and will listen to you. And also the question that I wanted to ask on the music, we know that the sounds of reggae, merengue, calypso, rumba, and zouk are distinctly Caribbean. And my question was, how do you feel, these are authentic rhythms that come from the Caribbeans, but however, we took them as sort of cliches connected to the Caribbeans. What's your take on it? How do we find the line between authenticity and cliche? I think that's my question.
Of course. I think that first of all, we need to sort of separate a little bit of what we're talking about, because I can guarantee you right now, there are very few Dominican people out there listening to like calypso and other, rhythms of the Caribbean. When we talk about the Dominican Republic, you have to visualize it not with the rest of the Caribbean islands, because culturally, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, which are the three Spanish Caribbean islands, are closer to South America, closer to like Colombia, closer to Venezuela, closer to like Central America in general, culturally and in all aspects, like art, music, language, everything, because we share that. And because also when the indigenous groups that you talked about, especially our indigenous group, the Arawak, are also migrated to Colombia and also to Venezuela, and I think Venezuela is the last place where they really, are able to live, because they were sadly mostly exterminated in the Dominican Republic. So when we talk about music, what we're really talking about is mostly merengue, bachata, and salsa, right? And those rhythms. I can't speak for calypso, I can't speak for reggae, but I can 100% sort of guarantee you that everybody that you're going to meet in your day-to-day life in the Dominican Republic is in some way or another listening to those rhythms. Like it's extremely common. And other, up and coming rhythms with, the younger crowd, because those are considered to be traditional. And though there are, newer things going on with that, mostly what you would hear with young people is, reggaeton, is, Latin trap, your Bad Bunny, your Anuel, which are also Rosalia, who I mentioned earlier. Those are the rhythms that you're listening to now. And I wouldn't say it's a cliche at all. I think it's I think that in the Dominican Republic, at least, we're very traditional when it comes to music, and we really enjoy. It's way more common to hear Dominican or Caribbean music rather than to hear somebody listen to like Justin Bieber or Taylor Swift. It's very rare the people that would listen to that. So I'm actually, it makes me very happy because in many ways, because I think that the new generation of musicians in the Caribbean are really starting to embrace that Caribbean culture in a really authentic way. There's a band, a hip hop band that I really enjoy that's called, listen to the name, Whitest Taino Alive. And they're such a fun group because their interpretation of Dominicanness is so much less traditional than what we're used to. They're, for example, they're making up new slang, like instead of a popular way to refer to women, and this might be a little bit sexist, but sadly part of the culture, is to refer them as cuero, which means kind of like, like a hoe. It would be the analogous in English. And they literally, it means leather. So they, instead of calling them cuero, they would call them leathers. And they're, taking bits of American culture, of the American culture that we get, because we have been raised with that American culture and it feels familiar to us, but not taking it either, just mixing it with the Dominican that we already have and producing something new that's different. And I think that out there, and also another musician, Richie Oriach, La Marimba, there are a lot of people now making really authentic Caribbean music based on those rhythms that I mentioned before.
I really think that our generation is really engaging with our traditional culture in a way that's slightly different than we ever have before. We are more aware of our Eurocentrism, and we are trying to definitely sort of get in touch with our roots. I think it's so wonderful. And to speak to something you said earlier, Sor, it's sometimes a little bit of a privilege and a curse when there is not enough representation of your culture in popular media, so that the few people who do become well known around the world, you become, and I mean, even regular people like me, when you go somewhere else, you become sort of ambassadors for your entire culture. And to a point, I think it's almost impossible to be able to represent, everybody as an individual, because everybody's their own person, right? And as steeped as you would be in the culture of your country, there's still going to be so many huge differences between what people think and how they feel, that it's hard sometimes having to be sort of that mediator between your culture and the rest of the world. And I think that the few people who have managed it are just so brave.
For sure.
I mentioned in my intro a couple of street festivals that are kind of, I don't know, attached to cultures in the Caribbean, like Carnival and Jose. And I see these on TV once in a while, but I'm wondering about maybe the street festival culture that may occasionally touch base with some of these musicians we're talking about, or how people assemble. Is that, in your estimation, really a good representation of Caribbean culture? Or is it just something that we occasionally see, carnivals starting up in Port of Spain or something like that? How would you feel about our impressions of these street festivals?
Well, in the Dominican Republic, it's specifically because it's what I know. It's definitely a celebration of our culture. You have these costumes that are tradition, and that they put together these huge parades, and it's very much a government sponsored sort of activity. It's not very spontaneous of people going out, not always. And it really is a way to celebrate our history, right? And what I really think is so interesting about this is that, because I read so many historical sources, there have been times when the Eurocentrism has been so entrenched in our culture that these festivals are denounced as, this is just a lot of people, we don't support this. This is a lot of people going into the streets and getting drunk. People should put a stop to this. And I think that for a few years, I want to say early in the 20th century, carnival celebrations actually came to a stop because people thought it wasn't very seemly that people were sort of celebrating in the streets. They wanted to be, the dominant culture wanted to be in ballrooms, and they wanted to have their social clubs, and they didn't want to. In a way, it's a class thing, as Lisa said earlier, of the dominant culture always wanting to control what the populace does, right? But right now, it's, obviously now we have completely moved away from that, and it's completely different.
Yes, and I feel that it is different in a lot of ways, but it also, what's behind it keeps on, keeping on, because the Dominican Republic is really sort of segregated by not so much as race, but by class, because you have a very small amount of people that have been probably having that amount of money since colonial times. The historian will confirm, but that have maintained that status, that have maintained that money throughout so long, that they really have exerted so much control that they were able to, and have been able to shape the way that we interpret our culture. Because even, let's say we were talking about merengue earlier, and merengue is an authentic rhythm, and a beautiful one at that, but the only reason that it still perseveres is because Trujillo, our infamous dictator in the 60s, had a personal liking to merengue, and before that it was seen as a very lower class, very disgusting thing to dance, and he is single-handedly credited for popularizing merengue in ballrooms, and that's why we have it. Whereas other popular rhythms like palos, which are equally as valid as merengue, are not seen as seen in our culture, because it seemed like, oh, that's just something that Black people do. It's not something that's valuable in the slightest. So
yes, I think it is important to know that a lot of these decisions are rooted in anti-Blackness, which is unfortunate that we are still dealing with sort of the consequence of hundreds of years of this anti-Blackness.
Exactly. But as Norma said, carnival culture in the Dominican Republic, it's a very beautiful time, and it is very I would always recommend visiting during carnival times, because it's such a vibrant expression of the beauty that is the Caribbean. And it's not as much about the the visuals and the costumes itself, but it's more about the roles, because they're like actors playing certain roles. You have characters like Roba la Gallina, and that you have to really sort of see, or that you really have to sort of know what they are and know the history behind what they do, so that you can really enjoy carnival in the way that we enjoy carnival.
Yeah,
It's visual storytelling, right?
Yeah.
It's telling our culture through dances, through characters, through costumes.
yeah. This is big in Czech Republic too. We've had a renaissance of what they call Masopust, which is the equivalent of Carnival, and it's fascinating to see. You've kind of touched upon how like a Ministry of Culture, a government-sponsored sort of way of having the thing happen versus how it just would naturally happen anyway because people want it. And I've seen that in post-communist Czech Republic as well.
Yeah.
There are so many questions that I actually would like to ask. You also mentioned the topic of race. You defined yourself of mixed race, Lisa. Would you like to comment on that, please?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. Okay, this is a very tricky subject in the Dominican Republic. As a way of erasing Black people and their culture from the country, the government decided, years and years ago, hundreds of years ago, that there weren't any Black people in the Dominican Republic. There weren't any white people in the Dominican Republic. We were all one mixed race, right? And this is why it's so apparent that the lines that divide us are more based on, on class than on race, because people in the Dominican Republic are raised to think that, oh, you are mixed, you're not white, you're not Black. And this is why there's I'm sure you guys have heard the meme and people in the US say like, I Black, I know Dominican, because when Dominicans emigrate to the United States or to emigrate to other countries where there is a very marked difference between Black people and white people, Dominicans are immediately parsed as Black because their skin tone predominantly is dark. So, but they would say, no, I'm not Black, I'm Dominican, because that's sadly what we're taught. We're taught to ignore our Black heritage. We're taught to, it's so strange because a couple, like in the pandemic, I was researching, new recipes as one does in a global pandemic. And I came across jollof rice and I was like, wow, that seems so foreign and delicious and exotic. Let me try that African recipe. And then when I look at the recipe, I'm like, what? This is locrio. I've been making this my entire life. Like, what on earth? This is not weird. And why it surprised me is because we are taught that our dish locrio comes from the Spanish paella, which has nothing to do with paella. It's a different rice, different method of preparation, different spices, different anything. Whereas it's identical to jollof rice, and yet we're still taught that. Even things like etymology, like mango is a mashed plantain recipe dish, stemming obviously from Africa, which is where they have plantains and they mash them. But when speaking about the etymology, your average Dominican is going to know this sort of joke history that, oh, it's called mango because an American tasted it and said, man, that's good. They're not going to know that it really stems from fufu, and it stems from the West African slaves that came to the Dominican Republic and were forced into slavery and forced to cook these dishes, because it's not, they don't want us to learn that. They want to pretend that everything that we have is Spanish, which is totally absurd. You go to Spain and you don't feel a connection with them at all. But the other day I was walking down the street and I saw a woman express her frustration, saying, like, making the sound like, and this is something that we call a chuipi and that we thought was, uniquely ours. But when you see like other African people do the same thing in the same way, you're like, oh, wow, we're not as Spanish as we thought.
And I think it's valid to point out the historical context of this. Sorry, but this is my passion.
Of course.
We did, as Lisa mentioned, we did have a dictator from 1930 to 1962 who was dedicated to erasing Blackness from our culture, right? Even to the point where there was a World's Fair in 1955 that he sort of created. And when you look at the products of that, you can definitely see like his erasure of anything that is Black. And just before that, there was an intervention, as you were saying earlier, Daniel, in Grenada. Well, in the Dominican Republic, we had two different military occupations from the United States, and that contributed to a lot of anti-Blackness as well. So we've been dragging on. It's like, it's not only our colonial history, but we have been throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Also, we have been sort of trained to think that the only way that we will be successful in an international context is to deny our inherent Blackness, right? And sort of appeal to that white gaze.
Sorry, I would like to just add one little thing, because I don't want people to feel that we're hiding this part of history, or feel that we're not giving it the credit that it deserves. But one important occasion tied to what Norma was speaking about was how in Trujillo's rule, he committed genocide against 20,000 Haitian people because of the color of their skin, because Haitian people are predominantly darker skinned. And this was done in a way that completely obliterated, a lot of the chances of Dominicans of having a healthy relationship with race.
Okay. Norma, did you want to finish something, or?
No, I mean, I think that's yeah. I really appreciate, Lisa, you bringing that up, because it's such a horrible moment in Dominican history, and it's something that should still be in our collective conscious, right?
Of course, but it's the same forces that committed these atrocious crimes have made it very difficult to teach and to continue to speak about it. So I don't blame anyone at all not having it their collective consciousness. It's that's how it was designed to be. So that's why it's important for us to speak up and continue remembering and reminding people.
Well, thank you so much for doing this, Lisa. I find this podcast extremely enriching. Daniel, this is blowing. This is mind blowing. We found out so much information in just less than an hour. It's incredible, and we are very grateful for that. Me as a tourist, I have been to the Caribbean just twice. A very short time, and every time I was confronted with these cliches that I was mentioning, especially going through the gates of an airport. You always find those small things that will make you connect and think, oh, that's their culture. Okay, let me get something of that. And for example, the spices, you go through an airport or the places where tourists go, and they will attract you with these little things that will make you think this is representative. Of course, it is representative, but there's so much more to it than just some music rhythms or just some spices to your dishes. And that's what the podcast normally is about. We're trying to debunk all the stereotypes and the cliches, and we try to go a little bit deeper, and we try to connect and with artistic communities out there if possible, or at least interlink people who have the same similarities or the same culture, and that's for us extremely important. And I will go to our last questions. I have two questions for you both. We asked this question to all of our guests. First of all, what do you feel, or what do you think it is the soul of the Caribbean in general, or of your island, if you want to focus exclusively on your island? So what is the soul? What do you think it is the soul of your culture or of your island? And second, the best things or places we would want to go as artists, as an artistic community, and we would not want to miss while being there.
Of course.
So for me, the soul of our area is probably the people. We carry the Caribbean within ourselves. Yes. And as far as your other question, there's a thriving artistic community here. There's so many curators, there's so many painters, sculptors, musicians, that I live in the city of Santo Domingo, which is the city that I know the best. And there are a lot of cultural centers. There are a lot of galleries where
Sorry, can you indicate for our listeners just one or two places that you find amazing that they should go to? So more practical if possible.
Okay, so there's definitely a gallery called Casa Quien, where it's a gallery, but it's also a social space. So a lot of artists will gather there, and you will definitely be sort of part of something when you visit.
Amazing.
Absolutely. Well, I think that, as Norma said, the soul of the Caribbean is really the people. I think that the way that we confront things is so unique to us. We're such a happy people, and we're so, we're very open, very, taken in with being able to make connections with other people. Like if you could just, stop at a Dominican colmado, which is like our version of like a corner store, and you crack open a beer and start talking with somebody, I'm sure that you'll have, like, as a tourist even, that you'll have a crowd of people joining us and talking to you and telling you what to do. So don't listen to it from me. If you visit the Dominican Republic, just stop somebody on the street and ask them, and they'll be more than happy to give you a tour or show you about. Like, that's the kind of group we are. That's the kind of things that we would do. And I would also recommend Casa Quien to any artists looking to find a community there. And I would also recommend for them to go to the Colonial Zone in Santo Domingo, which is also my city and also the one I know best. I think just walking around, a lot of small galleries open up. A lot of artists go there to take pictures, to paint, to draw, to sketch. And it would be a great place to find people. And one last place I would recommend is the where the museums are, especially the Modern Art Museum in Santo Domingo. Outside of in the courtyard, in the places outside of the museums, there's often a lot of artists there as well, undertaking different projects, and it's always a fun place to explore and to find like-minded people.
Amazing. Daniel, if you want to have a few final words,
Sure.
we'll wrap it up soon.
Yeah, I'm so happy that we have focused on Dominican Republic and we've touched base with other cultures and other islands. The idea of island hopping sounds inviting for the adventures of each Caribbean culture, but at the same time, maybe too superficial just to hop one to the other. Just like the many cultures of any continent, we need to go deep whenever possible and appreciate the stories that come out from those who have settled, those that have always been there, those who have heard from neighbors and who have been heard, as this podcast has attempted. So thank you so much for sharing the Caribbean soul.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you guys for creating this platform for us to speak about.
So Jason mentioned yesterday that he feels very much, he's from Barbados and he's strongly rooted in his culture, but he mentioned whenever I'm abroad, he's been in the US and Canada, I represent the entire Caribbean. So I'm somehow, he also mentioned that the soul would be the people, because the roots are definitely there, and even though there are so many, there is so much diversity, and it should be diversity, and it should be celebrated. Somehow, at some point, you are reunited, and you become one when you represent in the world your culture and your traditions. So I'm actually super happy to have found you guys. And sometimes, the internet helps us a lot to connect with people and to find mind-like persons. And it has been incredibly enriching. We are super grateful for this podcast. Like I said, we will have two parts. The first part with you, and the second part will be more of a talk with Jason on different aspects regarding Barbados. We wanted definitely to have some sort of let's say, common thread and common idea, but I realized that it's so diverse and it's so important to have tackled with specific subjects like you did. I really appreciated that from both of you. that it has become something very rich and very important to leave it as it is and not to compress it to 1 hour and a half, and as we normally have our podcast. So that being said, thank you so much for being part of the podcast, and I'll see you guys to the next podcast. Our next podcast would be focusing on Dublin. We will take a ride to Dublin and connect with the artistic communities out there. So this has been wonderful. All the best.